They thought death would protect them from the world. They were dead wrong. These 20 famous graves became crime scenes, and what was stolen will make your blood run cold. Charlie Chaplin. 2 months after his death, grave robbers dug up Charlie Chaplin's coffin and vanished with his body. Charlie Chaplin was the silent film genius who created timeless classics like The Kid and Modern Times. With his bowler hat and cane, he became one of the most recognized and beloved entertainers in history, bringing laughter to millions worldwide. In March 1978, just months after Chaplin's death at age 88, his grave in Coursier-sur-Vevey, Switzerland, was disturbed. Thieves dug up his coffin and stole his body, demanding ransom from his widow, Una Chaplin. Terrified, she received repeated calls asking for hundreds of thousands of dollars in exchange for the safe return of her husband's remains. The bizarre crime shocked the world, turning the quiet Swiss village into the center of a macabre international manhunt. After weeks of investigation, police arrested 2 men from Eastern Europe who had carried out the theft. Chaplin's coffin was found buried in a nearby cornfield, less than a mile from his home. To ensure such a crime could never happen again, his body was reinterred under a thick slab of reinforced concrete, making it impossible for future grave robbers to disturb him. Abraham Lincoln. Grave robbers once plotted to steal Abraham Lincoln's body and hold it for ransom. Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, led the nation through the Civil War and ended slavery. Assassinated in 1865, he was laid to rest in Springfield, Illinois, where his tomb became a place of pilgrimage for Americans. But in 1876, a group of counterfeiters hatched a shocking plan. They intended to break into Lincoln's tomb, steal his coffin, and demand the release of one of their imprisoned gang members. On a cold November night, they entered the mausoleum, pried open the sarcophagus, and attempted to remove the coffin. What they didn't know was that undercover Secret Service agents had infiltrated their gang. The robbers were caught in the act before they could escape with the president's remains. The failed plot horrified the nation. To ensure Lincoln's body would never be disturbed again, his coffin was secretly reburied beneath 10 feet of concrete inside his tomb. When the casket was opened in 1901 to confirm, witnesses testified that Lincoln's body was astonishingly well preserved. Since then, his grave has remained untouched, sealed against any future attempt. Benito Mussolini. The dictator's grave was empty, his body stolen under cover of night by loyalists. Benito Mussolini, Italy's fascist leader during World War II, ruled with an iron fist until he was captured and executed by partisans in 1945. His body was publicly displayed in Milan, hanging upside down in the city square as a symbol of his downfall. Later, he was buried in an unmarked grave in Milan's Mazzocco Cemetery to prevent his grave from becoming a rallying point. But in April 1946, a group of neo-fascist supporters carried out a daring raid. They broke into the cemetery and dug up Mussolini's body, spiriting it away in secret. For months, authorities searched desperately while rumors spread about the missing corpse. Some claimed it was hidden in convents, others that it was being worshipped in underground ceremonies. Eventually, the police tracked it down to a monastery where sympathizers had been hiding it. The body was recovered and kept under government control for over a decade, away from public view. Only in 1957 was it finally returned to Mussolini's family and buried in his hometown of Predoppio, where it remains to this day, still a site of controversy, attracting both mourners and protesters. Eva Peron. For nearly 2 decades, her body vanished, smuggled across continents and scarred by mistreatment. Eva Peron, beloved First Lady of Argentina, was adored by millions as the champion of the poor. When she died of cancer in 1952 at just 33, the nation was devastated. Her embalmed body was placed on public display, drawing crowds who came to grieve the woman they called Evita. But in 1955, a military coup overthrew her husband, President Juan Perón. The new rulers saw Eva's tomb as a dangerous symbol, fearing it could inspire uprisings. Under cover of secrecy, they seized her remains and smuggled them out of Buenos Aires. For years, the body's location was unknown. Hidden in warehouses, moved between military offices, and even shipped overseas. Eventually, her coffin was transported to Italy, where it was buried under a false name in a Milan cemetery. Rumors spread of abuse and desecration during her years in hiding, with reports of the body being mishandled and damaged. In 1971, after long negotiations, Eva's remains were exhumed and returned to Juan Perón, then living in exile in Spain. Finally, in 1976, her body was brought home to Argentina and placed in a fortified crypt at Recoleta Cemetery in Buenos Aires. Today, the grave is reinforced to withstand any attempt at theft or desecration, reflecting the extraordinary, turbulent journey of a woman who remains larger than life and death. Thomas Paine. The man who inspired revolutions could not rest in peace, his bones stolen and scattered across history. Thomas Paine, the English-born writer of Common Sense and the Rights of Man, was one of the most influential voices of the American and French revolutions. Yet despite shaping nations, he died in 1809 in New York, poor and largely forgotten. He was buried on his small farm in New Rochelle, his grave unmarked except for a simple headstone. In 1819, 10 years after his death, radical journalist William Cobbett decided Paine deserved a hero's burial in England. Cobbett secretly dug up the grave, removed the remains, and shipped them across the Atlantic. But once in England, his plan fell apart. Cobbett struggled to raise funds for a memorial, and Paine's coffin languished in storage. Over time, the skeleton was broken up and lost piece by piece. Some bones were reportedly sold, others handed to collectors, and parts of Paine's skull and hair circulated among enthusiasts. By the late 19th century, no one knew exactly what had happened to most of his body. Today, only fragments believed to belong to Paine have resurfaced, while the majority of his remains remain missing. For a man who championed liberty and equality, his final fate is a story of neglect, controversy, and desecration. His bones as restless as the revolutions he once ignited. Joseph Haydn. When the great composer died, grave robbers stole his head, believing his skull held the secret to genius. Joseph Haydn, often called the father of the symphony, was one of the most celebrated composers of the 18th century. He died in 1809 in Vienna, at the age of 77, mourned across Europe for his musical brilliance. He was buried in Hunsturm Cemetery, and later plans were made to move him to a more fitting memorial. But soon after his burial, two men obsessed with phrenology, the pseudoscience that claimed a person's skull shape revealed their character and talents, hatched a disturbing plan. Believing Haydn's head might reveal the source of his genius, they bribed cemetery workers, dug up his grave, and stole his skull. When Haydn's remains were exhumed in 1820 for reburial in Eisenstadt, officials discovered the coffin was missing its head. The thieves had replaced it with another skull, hoping no one would notice. For decades, Haydn's skull passed through private collectors and secret societies, studied and displayed as a curiosity. It wasn't until 1954 that his skull was finally reunited with the rest of his body, which had long since been reinterred in Eisenstadt. Today, his tomb contains both the original skull and the replacement one, a bizarre reminder of how even in death, one of music's greatest masters could not escape the obsessions of his admirers. Galileo Galilei. Centuries after his death, admirers secretly stole his body parts, turning them into relics of science. Galileo Galilei, the father of modern science, changed the world with his discoveries in astronomy and physics. When he died in 1642, he was buried quietly in Florence, Italy, as the Catholic Church considered him a heretic for supporting Copernicus' theory that the Earth orbits the Sun. A century later, in 1737, his remains were moved to a grand tomb inside the Basilica of Santa Croce, where Italy's greatest minds are honored. But during the reburial, admirers took the opportunity to steal parts of his body. Fingers, a tooth, and even a vertebra were removed from the coffin, kept as relics by private collectors who viewed them as treasures of genius. For generations, these grisly souvenirs circulated in secret, passed from one hand to another. In recent years, several of these relics resurfaced. 2 fingers and a tooth were discovered in 2009 inside a glass container, now displayed at the Museo Galileo in Florence. His vertebra rests at the University of Padua, while another finger has long been exhibited as a holy relic of science. Galileo's grand tomb in Santa Croce remains intact, but the missing pieces of his body remind us how even death could not stop the world's fascination with the man who redefined the universe. Jim Morrison. Fans turned his grave into a shrine, vandals defaced it, and even his bust was stolen. Jim Morrison, the charismatic frontman of The Doors, became a counterculture icon with his hypnotic voice and poetic lyrics. When he died in Paris in 1971 at just 27, he joined the infamous 27 Club. He was buried in Père Lachaise Cemetery, one of the most visited graveyards in the world. where legends like Oscar Wilde and Frédéric Chopin also rest. Almost immediately, Morrison's grave became a magnet for fans and tourists. People covered the site with graffiti, carved messages into nearby tombs, and left behind alcohol, drugs, and wild tributes. The chaos grew so out of control that in 1981, vandals stole the bronze bust of Morrison that had marked his grave, leaving it bare. Authorities struggled to contain the constant desecration. Guards were posted, barriers were built, and eventually the cemetery installed a simple stone marker with his name in Greek, meaning true to his own spirit. Even that has been repeatedly vandalized over the years. Today, Morrison's grave remains one of the most visited in the world, both a place of pilgrimage and controversy. For some, it's a sacred site to honor a rock legend. For others, it's a scarred reminder of how fame follows even into death. Oscar Wilde. The great writer's tomb became a canvas for lipstick kisses and graffiti, leaving it scarred for decades. Oscar Wilde, the Irish playwright and poet, was one of the most brilliant and controversial figures of the late 19th century. Known for the picture of Dorian Gray and his biting wit, Wilde died in exile in Paris in 1900 after years of scandal and imprisonment. He was buried in Père Lachaise Cemetery, where his elaborate tomb was designed by sculptor Jacob Epstein. Over the years, Wilde's grave transformed into one of the cemetery's most visited sites. Admirers from around the world left flowers, notes, and, most notoriously, lipstick kisses on the stone monument. What began as a gesture of affection soon turned into widespread vandalism. The porous limestone absorbed the oils and dyes, permanently staining and damaging the surface. Graffiti carved by fans further eroded the tomb, leaving it battered and scarred. By the 2000s, conservationists sounded the alarm, warning that the monument was deteriorating beyond repair. In 2011, after a costly restoration, the French authorities installed a tall glass barrier around the tomb to prevent direct contact. Now visitors can only admire it from behind the shield. Though protected today, Oscar Wilde's tomb remains a testament to how adoration can blur into desecration. His resting place both honored and violated by the passions he continues to inspire. Karl Marx. Even in death, the philosopher of revolution became a target, his grave smashed with hammers and paint. Karl Marx, the German thinker behind the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital, died in 1883 and was buried in London's Highgate Cemetery. At first, his grave was a modest one, marked only by a simple stone. But in 1956, to honor his legacy, a towering granite monument with a bronze bust of Marx was erected, turning the site into a place of pilgrimage for socialists and curiosity seekers from around the world. Yet the grave has long drawn both admirers and enemies. Over the years, vandals defaced it with paint, slogans, and scratches. The worst attack came in 2019, when assailants struck the headstone with a hammer, chipping away at the original 19th century stone slab that bore the names of Marx and his family. A week later, it was splattered with red paint, echoing the violence of political hatred. The repeated assaults sparked outrage among historians and activists who condemned the desecration as an attack on history itself. The cemetery has since increased surveillance, but the scars on the monument remain visible. Today, Marx's grave stands both as a memorial to one of the most influential thinkers of modern times and as a contested symbol, forever caught in the crossfire between reverence and resentment. Mahatma Gandhi. Decades after his assassination, vandals defaced his memorial and even stole some of his ashes. Mahatma Gandhi, leader of India's independence movement, became a global symbol of nonviolence and justice. After his assassination in 1948, his body was cremated, and his ashes were divided and sent to various locations across India and abroad for enshrinement. The main memorial, Raj Ghat in New Delhi, became a sacred place visited by millions each year. But Gandhi's legacy has not been safe from desecration. In October 2019, on the 150th anniversary of his birth, vandals attacked a memorial in Rewa, Madhya Pradesh. They stole a portion of his ashes that had been preserved there for decades and defaced the site with green paint. Across the walls, they scrawled the word traitor, echoing the slur used by his assassin, Nathuram Godse. The act horrified the nation. Police launched investigations, but the stolen ashes were never recovered. For many, the crime was more than theft. It was an insult to one of the most revered figures in modern history. Despite tighter security at other memorials, the desecration remains a stark reminder that even the legacy of a man who preached peace and unity is vulnerable to hatred and division long after death. Emmett Till, the teenager whose murder shook America, still cannot rest in peace. His memorial repeatedly shot up and vandalized. Emmett Till was just 14 years old when he was brutally murdered in Mississippi in 1955 after being falsely accused of offending a white woman. His death and the open casket funeral held by his mother, Mamie Till, exposed the horrors of racial violence and helped spark the civil rights movement. He was buried in Burr Oak Cemetery in Illinois, but it is his memorial signs in Mississippi that have faced relentless desecration. The first roadside marker, installed near the site where his body was pulled from the Tallahatchie River, was repeatedly defaced with graffiti and bullet holes. One sign was riddled with more than 100 bullet marks, destroyed only weeks after its installation. Others were stolen outright. In response, the Emmett Till Memorial Commission replaced the signs again and again, each time stronger than before. In 2019, the latest version was installed, made of bulletproof steel and weighing 500 pounds. Surveillance cameras now guard the site, which has become both a place of mourning and a symbol of the ongoing struggle against hate. Emmett Till's story continues to resonate worldwide, and the repeated attacks on his memorial show how the wounds of his death remain raw, decades after the crime that changed history. Rudolf Hess, to stop neo-Nazis from turning it into a shrine, even his grave was destroyed and his ashes scattered. Rudolf Hess, Adolf Hitler's deputy in the early years of the Nazi regime, was one of the most notorious figures of World War II. Captured after his mysterious solo flight to Scotland in 1941, he spent the rest of his life in prison. In 1987, at the age of 93, he died in Spandau Prison, Berlin, and was buried in his family's plot in Wunsiedel, Bavaria. But his grave quickly became a magnet for neo-Nazi sympathizers, who gathered there each year to honor him with rallies and demonstrations. Despite police efforts, the site grew into a pilgrimage point for extremists, sparking anger and protests from local residents and victims' groups. In 2011, after years of tension, Hess's family and the Lutheran Church made a drastic decision. His body was exhumed, cremated, and his ashes scattered at sea in a secret location. The headstone and grave were destroyed to erase any physical trace that could attract future gatherings. Today, Hess's memory lives on only in history books. His grave, once a rallying point for hate, no longer exists, removed to prevent his resting place from becoming a monument to the ideology he served. Grigory Rasputin, feared as a mystic and hated as a manipulator, even his grave was dug up and his body burned to ashes. Grigory Rasputin, the Russian mystic and advisor to the Romanov royal family, was both revered and despised in early 20th century Russia. His influence over Tsarina Alexandra made him one of the most controversial figures of the empire. In 1916, he was assassinated by nobles who saw him as a threat to the monarchy. He was buried in a modest grave near Tsarskoye Selo, close to the royal family's residence. But only a year later, the Russian Revolution erupted, and Rasputin's resting place became a liability. Fearing that his grave could become a shrine for monarchists or a target for angry mobs, Bolshevik authorities ordered it destroyed. Soldiers dug up his coffin, dragged his corpse into the woods, and set it on fire. Witnesses recalled seeing his body consumed by flames as the revolutionaries ensured that nothing of him would remain. The decision to obliterate his grave symbolized the new regime's determination to erase the legacy of both Rasputin and the monarchy he served. Today, no marker or tomb exists. His resting place was reduced to ash, leaving behind only the legends and myths that continue to surround his life and death. Elvis Presley. Just weeks after his death, grave robbers plotted to steal the king's body from his tomb. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, died suddenly in 1977 at his Graceland mansion in Memphis, Tennessee. His death shocked the world, and thousands of grieving fans flocked to pay their respects. He was first buried at Forest Hill Cemetery, alongside his mother, Gladys. But Elvis's fame made his grave an immediate target. In late August 1977, only days after the funeral, police uncovered a chilling plan. A group of men were conspiring to dig up Presley's body and hold it for ransom. The scheme was foiled before the robbers could act, but the scare proved how vulnerable his resting place was. In response, Elvis's father, Vernon Presley, sought permission to move his son's remains. Within weeks, both Elvis and his mother were reburied in the meditation garden at Graceland, under heavy security and behind walls that fans could only admire from outside. Today, the Meditation Garden is one of the most visited private grave sites in the world, drawing millions of fans each year. The failed grave robbery attempt ensured that Elvis's final resting place would be forever protected, turning Graceland into both a sanctuary and a shrine to the king. Al Capone. Even in death, America's most infamous gangster couldn't escape vandalism at his grave. Al Capone, the notorious Chicago mob boss of the Prohibition era, built an empire on bootlegging, gambling, and violence. Arrested for tax evasion in 1931, he spent years in prison before dying in 1947 at the age of 48. Despite his bloody reputation, his funeral drew crowds, and he was buried in Mount Olivet Cemetery in Chicago. But his grave soon became a hotspot for vandals and curiosity seekers. The original family plot was repeatedly defaced, with visitors chipping away pieces of the headstone as souvenirs. Some even scrawled graffiti on the marker, turning it into a grotesque attraction. Concerned about the ongoing desecration, the Capone family eventually had his remains moved to Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois. There, Al Capone was laid to rest beside other family members, but even this site has not been free from damage. His headstone has been replaced multiple times due to theft and vandalism, as fans and detractors alike continue to target it. Today, Capone's grave remains a place of uneasy fascination, protected but still scarred by the public's obsession with a man whose name is forever tied to crime and violence. Harry Houdini. The master escape artist could not escape the vandals who targeted his grave for decades. Harry Houdini, the world-famous magician and escape artist, thrilled audiences in the early 20th century with daring stunts that defied logic and danger. When he died in 1926 at just 52, thousands attended his funeral in New York. He was buried in Machpelah Cemetery in Queens, under a grand monument topped with a bust of his likeness. But Houdini's grave quickly became a magnet for fans and vandals. The marble bust was stolen repeatedly, sometimes smashed into pieces, other times disappearing entirely. Graffiti scarred the headstone, and parts of the monument were broken or chipped away by souvenir hunters. Over the decades, his once proud memorial fell into serious disrepair, leaving the grave neglected and battered. Magician societies and preservation groups eventually stepped in, restoring the site and replacing the stolen bust with replicas. Today, Houdini's grave is maintained with greater security and care, but it still bears the scars of a century of obsession. The man who spent his life escaping from locks, chains, and cages could never escape the grip of fascination. Even in death, his resting place became part of the spectacle. Che Guevara. His enemies severed his hands, hid his body, and left his grave a mystery for decades. Ernesto Che Guevara, the Argentine revolutionary who fought alongside Fidel Castro, became one of the most iconic figures of the 20th century. After years of leading guerrilla movements across Latin America, he was captured in Bolivia in 1967 and executed by the Bolivian army. Instead of returning his body to Cuba, the Bolivian authorities secretly buried him in an unmarked grave near Valle Grande. To prove his death, they severed his hands and sent them to Havana for fingerprint confirmation, while rumors spread that the rest of his body had been burned or hidden. For decades, Guevara's burial site was the subject of speculation, fueling myths and conspiracies about his fate. It wasn't until 1997 that a team of Cuban and Argentine scientists finally discovered his remains beneath a Bolivian airstrip. His body was exhumed and flown to Cuba, where it was reburied in a grand mausoleum in Santa Clara, the city where he had led a decisive battle during the revolution. Today, his grave is a national monument and a site of pilgrimage. But the decades of secrecy, mutilation, and concealment ensured that even Che Guevara's death carried the same aura of defiance and controversy that defined his life. Ludwig van Beethoven. Even the great composer's skull was disturbed, fragments taken and scattered before being returned centuries later. Ludwig van Beethoven, one of history's greatest composers, died in Vienna in 1827 after a long struggle with illness. His funeral drew thousands of mourners, and he was buried in Waring Cemetery before later being moved to Vienna's Central Cemetery, where many of Austria's musical giants rest. But Beethoven's grave did not remain untouched. In the 19th century, during exhumations and studies of his remains, souvenir hunters and scientists disturbed his skull. Several fragments were taken, some passed quietly through families, others ending up in private collections abroad. For generations, pieces of Beethoven's head were scattered, while the rest of his body remained in Vienna. In recent years, some of those missing fragments resurfaced. A few bone pieces believed to be from his skull were returned to Vienna and are now held by museums and researchers. While they help shed light on his mysterious health problems, their long journey is also a story of theft and desecration. Today, Beethoven's grave stands as a place of honor and reverence, yet his remains tell a different story. How even in death, the world could not resist laying claim to pieces of a genius. Jeremy Bentham, the philosopher who wanted his body preserved, became a target of theft and pranks. Jeremy Bentham, the English philosopher and reformer, died in 1832 after leaving behind a curious final request. He asked that his body be preserved and displayed as an auto-icon for public viewing. His skeleton was dressed in his clothes, topped with a wax head, and placed in a glass cabinet at University College London, where it remains to this day. But Bentham's unusual resting place soon became the subject of mischief. His real head, mummified poorly, was placed at his feet and became a magnet for pranksters. Over the years, students repeatedly stole it, once even holding it for ransom as part of a college tradition. At other times, the head was displayed during debates or bizarrely treated as a kind of trophy. Eventually, the university decided to secure it permanently. Today, Bentham's mummified head is locked away in a safe, while his wax replica watches over the display. Though technically not a grave, his auto-icon remains one of the strangest and most desecrated memorials in history. Bentham wanted his body to inspire future generations, but instead, parts of him became the subject of theft, ridicule, and legend.